Hello, my name is Michael Nolan. Today's lesson is on supply chain management. The outline, as you can see, involves supply chain management, how it works, purchasing, stock management, suppliers. So let's first look at supply chain management and see what is involved in it. Let's have a definition first of all. This is over 2 slides, so please bear with me. Supply chain management, SCM for short, is about coordinating and integrating the management of materials, information, and finances as they move forward and backwards along the chain from supplier to manufacturer to wholesaler to retailer to consumer. So that's what it's about. It's about moving along the supply chain. If you take it as a long piece of rope in which there's different stages you go through and all the way along, and you're managing that system. That's what it's all about, managing that system, managing the supply chain. So, supply chain history. Its early roots were in the 1920s, at the start of assembly lines. Up to then, companies generally made almost everything themselves. If you think of, say, the Ford Motor Company, they would have made everything themselves initially, or almost everything. They started making the metal itself and then processing it. But as assembly lines became into fashion in the 20s, a lot of that work was subcontracted out to what they call sub-suppliers. And they fed into the main assembly lines and just made the whole business more efficient. So that was the start of the supply chain history. It really didn't develop very much until the 1960s with the introduction of what's called EDI, which is electronic data interchange. It meant that companies could communicate with each other a lot more easily, and therefore the whole supply chain sophistication developed a lot. It developed even further in the 80s when I suppose the generation of PCs became a lot more available to people, common with the fact that there was a bigger global market that people looked at, and they were addressing things globally. So the supply chain became very much important at that point. So, in the US, initially used to drive down cost. So that was the main emphasis of it, is how can we improve our cost, improve our efficiency, and I suppose be able to use price as a weapon then. As your costing reduced down, you can then reduce your prices and increase your market share. Or alternatively, you can increase your profits. In Japan, it was used to integrate suppliers into the overall system. They have what they call a keiretsu, a group of companies all working together for the main company. But it integrated them a lot more. And supply chain onto a factory line can mean products coming every month, to every week, to every day, and in some cases they are coming in every hour, updated, usually by local suppliers which are integrated into the system and know exactly when to deliver more product. Globalization has increased its importance, and that's very true, because as we have been thinking about becoming global and going out towards that, the system gets a lot more complex. You need to be pulling in all of these systems together so that they tie in, so that there's a smooth transfer, particularly say from, we'll take an example of China selling components to America, which are then developed into semi-products and sold to Europe, where they're developed into full products and then sold throughout the world. So in that sort of complexity, you do need a very good supply chain management system. Okay, supply chain processes. Key supply chain processes include order fulfillment, client management, supplier management, manufacturing management. All of these are equally important. Order fulfillment is being able to respond to orders and to react in time, in the appropriate time. Client management, as the name suggests, is about managing the client. It may not be the end user, but it would be a customer. And you're managing the process for them. Supplier management, where you're managing the component suppliers or the product suppliers, where they're coming from. And it's an integrated system. And it includes, in some cases, manufacturing management, where you're making the products yourself, as well as the supply chain service. The basics elements of SCM, supply chain management. 1, plan. You can see it here on the top left. Top right, then 2, source. Then it's below that you have 3, make, 4, deliver, and 5, return. Each of those have an important and equal important part in delivering the whole supply chain management. If we take the first one, to plan, you're strategically managing resources here, and you have to do that in a very coordinated and a fluid way that makes sure the system works, and has to be planned well in advance. Number 2, source. Well, you have to source where you're going to buy the material from, pricing, delivery payment, processes. Make sure they're all in line and working well. Otherwise, you might run into difficulties. 3, make. Well, this you're into scheduled production runs, packaging, delivery, and making sure again that it's coordinating in and it's needed. It's made as it's needed and that it's made in time. 4, delivery. So you're getting the orders to customers on time, in full, so that you're meeting their full requirements. And therefore, it's meeting the customer satisfaction. 5, return. That's a system for managing returns if there's, say, a problem with product that it's broken or something like that, there's a complaint with it, that you have a system for returns there. You also need a system for returns where, for example, they have ordered too much and they want to return a certain amount of it. You need systems for that. So in all of these, you need return systems as appropriate for the different situations as they arise. Now, leading companies moving up the value chain to add value and putting efforts into developing suppliers. So the first one, moving up the value chain to add value. So that is about that they're trying to forward integrate in order to be more controlling of the whole supply chain and increase the value. And as companies become more sophisticated, they tend to move up the value chain and control that element. In doing so, they may contain and retain what they have already, or they may pass that on, sell it on to somebody else. But as they're increasing their sophistication, they're moving up the value chain to add value. The second one then, putting efforts into developing suppliers. It's not enough just to say, oh, I'll pick you, you, and you. You have to then work with them and make sure they have the capabilities of meeting your standards. And your standards should be high. And you should know what you need to get the products from them on time, in full, as required. And there's no point in them delivering them late or saying, oh, something happened, sorry about that. Because your customer is relying on you managing the system for them. Next, we have monitoring smaller suppliers. Help suppliers with transfer of knowledge and rely on smaller companies for particular expertise. So in the first of these, monitoring smaller suppliers or mentoring smaller suppliers, that's about working with the suppliers and where you can see there are weaknesses. There may not be huge weaknesses, but you want to build them up. So you'll mentor them and you'll tell them, your weakness is here, this is what you need to try and do to improve that. And you're guiding them along in making improvement activity. This is very important in trying to reach a good level of return from the suppliers. Help suppliers with transfer of knowledge. Well, partly in the mentoring you're doing that, but also in helping them to understand systems knowledge, helping to understand how your systems work will help them to appreciate the constraints that you're working under, and then you're transferring that so they can then work within those constraints as well and make sure that they're delivering to you when needed. Rely on smaller companies for particular expertise. I think one of the examples I could give you on that is if a company, for example, had a particular knowledge on a sub-assembly and they were experts in that area, you would use that expertise to help develop further improvements in the product and build on that for the ultimate customer company. And you're relying on these companies, you know what strengths they have, you know what weaknesses they have. The previous two comments in relation to the weaknesses, but this is in relation to the strengths. So you're using their strengths, you know their expertise, and you're saying, yes, I can get information and help from them in relation to maybe a new product that we're developing for the company. Purchasing. Purchasing, price is king. Have you heard that before? I certainly have. Buying on price only, opportunities missed. And that is very true. If you're buying on price only, what can I say about it? You're bound to fail. You may have the cheapest product, the cheapest component, but you'll probably have quality problems. You'll probably have on-time delivery problems. I remember one company that went through a cycle of, they had problems with cash flow, and because of that, they had to go to the cheapest supplier. And because they're going to the cheapest supplier, they started having quality problems. And because they're having quality problems, they started having more problems with customers. And this was a negative cycle that went out of control, and they're no longer in business. So you have to be careful of looking at all of the aspects and not just price. Price is not the only thing involved. Some countries seen as cheaper alternatives. Mazda could not afford it, supplier costs. And suppliers have expert knowledge in their systems. For the first one, some countries seen as cheaper alternatives. If you go back 20 years ago, certainly in Europe where I live, and I live in Ireland, Ireland and say Portugal were seen as cheap economies. That's where you go to make products cheaper. It then moved to Eastern Europe, to places like Poland, Slovakia. It then moved to China now and India and places like that. In the future, it will move again. More likely, it'll be maybe Vietnam or somewhere like that. But it will move again. It doesn't stay there all the time. So you can't compete on price alone. There are always cheaper alternatives elsewhere. You have to change the game and be selling your products or looking at suppliers and more than just price. Mazda could not afford it. Excuse the pun there. What I mean by that is when Ford started looking outside for suppliers in Japan, they went to Mazda. And one of the things they discovered was the people managing the supplier process in Mazda, given there's difference in style, there's difference in size, but allowing for the difference in size, Mazda had 20% of the staff that Ford had, which meant they were a lot more efficient. And this amazed Ford, how can you manage it? And the main reason is because they had integrated with their suppliers a lot more fully. They worked with them on the purchasing, they worked with them on developing new innovative products, they worked with them on minimizing the bureaucracy around the supply chain system. And as a result, they drove it down. They made the purchasing leaner, ultimately. As we have been saying before in different lessons, lean is not just about manufacturing, it's about marketing, it's about purchasing, it's about management. It's about all aspects of the business. And so in supplier management, they were only 20% of the cost of Ford. Supplier knowledge is, suppliers have expert knowledge in their systems. And that's very true because they understand their systems very, very well. So you have to build on that knowledge and try and maximize the benefits of that. Supplier identification. A business must identify those suppliers who do not meet its requirements, could develop to meet those requirements, or will not or cannot meet those requirements. So those are three choices. Putting it bluntly, companies we can definitely work with, companies we might work with, companies we don't want to work with at all. So we're looking at things like, do you have a list of requirements that companies must meet? And if so, what are they? So the first one is saying that companies meet all the requirements straight away, they're automatically into the system because they're good enough. The second is saying, could develop to meet those requirements. They may need to do some work to improve the process. So you start working with them and maybe buying a little bit from them and trying to then build that up by building the company up, building their systems up and making them stronger. Will not or cannot meet those needs, well, that speaks for itself. They're not good enough, they never will be. Maybe they have the wrong attitude, but you can't work with them in the criteria you have set. So therefore, you just walk away. Stock management. Most expensive component is out of stock. And balancing act, too much versus too little. At best, if you're out of stock of a component, at best it's a sort of a changeover situation that you have to change from one product to another product. So you have downtime in the changeover of that. You have to have half-made stock sitting around waiting. I remember I went through a company and the factory was absolutely full of half-made stock because they had, in some cases, run out of components. And it was horrific to look at. So you can't afford to be out of stock. On the other hand, you can't afford to have too much stock, ties up cash, ties up space, and may go out of business in terms of being not useful anymore because it goes bad, depending on the product. So it's very much a balancing act of trying to have enough stock that you can manage without too much, without too little. And that's what this is all about. It's about managing your stock there as best you can. Traditional approach is paper or computer. I suppose paper is the real traditional approach and the computer is the more recent traditional approach. It's time consuming, expensive, and it can be inaccurate. Lean approach is ABC analysis and Kanban. So let's go back up to traditional approach. If you have a traditional approach, it's bureaucratic, it adds cost to the system, you have data entry, you have analysis, you have reports, all adding value, or non-value I should say, to the process, so that it slows it down and it's very bureaucratic. Time consuming, expensive, and can be inaccurate. Well, unless you're reaching a 95% accuracy on your stock, it is going to be inaccurate and you can't really trust it. So you do need to be careful in that. And a lot of companies, let's just say they're not very bureaucratic and they're not very demanding, and they will just sort of take stuff, you don't know it's gone, so it's out of the system. And as a result, it might be 90% accurate, it might be 85% accurate. And therefore, the likelihood of a stock out increases enormously. Lean approach, ABC analysis, we've mentioned that before in the marketing side and other areas like that in finance. Using ABCs to signify qualifying the quality of the supplier. So, ABC analysis. List all the stock in store, sort out by annual usage value, AUV, and the AUV is equal to annual usage multiplied by unit cost. So if you have a component that you use $100,000 of it, and it's worth $10 for each component, that's $1 million in AUV. So it's just a simple way of looking at it. A class, top 80% of annual spend. So you're looking at that. B class, the next 15%. And the C class is the last 5%. Why do we do that? Because what we find is if you look at the top 80%, it's not a huge amount of actual components. It's probably a small enough amount because there's usually a number of very high priced ones, and then there's a medium range, and then there's a smaller range, and there might be more volume in the smaller range, but the value overall is not as great. Let's look at some of this, some additional considerations, and these are important because the ABC isn't just based totally on cost. You have to look at the availability. If you're buying stock from far away from the other side of the world, if say you're in Africa and you're buying stock from China, it's a long way away. So you need to have time for that stock to come in and be delivered to wherever you are. And that will take time, so you have to take that into account. Space requirements. Very often, stock can take up a huge amount of space, and if, for example, you have a stock that's far away and you need to buy it in bulk, you need huge space requirements, so they have to be taken into account as well. And long lead time, as we talked about there, in terms of if it's coming from far away. Shelf life, that's also important. And you'd be surprised, not just in, say, fresh food components. I know a company in the country where I live, they had a problem with plastics. Because they didn't use the oldest plastic components they had when they were making components, some of them were waiting too long, and they went kind of yellowy colour, off-white. The new components were white, the old components were off-white. So when they put the white with the off-white, it looked terrible. And as a result, there was a lot of productivity lost when those components had to be thrown out. may need to adjust the ABC to reflect the above, and that's very true. So you look at your ABC and then you look at, well, what are the complexities with each of these components, and then work out what way ranking do we give them then, ultimately. ABC analysis and Kanban. A-class stocks are managed aggressively, kept together in stores or where they are used. So what that means is the A stocks you look after very closely, you monitor very closely, and you manage very closely. So you work with everybody in the company in making sure you just have enough so that you don't have a stock out situation, but not too much because they are a huge cost on the cash flow situation. Kept together in stores or where they are used. What that means is that you would keep enough for maybe a day or maybe a half a day at a particular part of the production facility on site there, so that they're used immediately in that day or half day period. And they're not there at the end of the day. And you keep them in stores prominently so that they're very much in your face when you go into the stores area. They're there so you can see them, you can see how well they're being managed. Work with suppliers to minimize stock levels. What does that mean? Well, working with suppliers to minimize stock levels, you're talking about things like call-offs, where you have an agreement with the supplier that you would buy a certain amount in the year and you would call it off as you need it. You'd also be looking at for just-in-time deliveries is another way of looking at that they will deliver just when you need it or a day or two before. And if they're close to you, you can get arrangements like that. If they're far away, no, not really. But you can have the alternatives of the two there. Opportunities to rationalize supplier lists. What that means is that you don't just keep going to the same supplier all the time. You look at the suppliers and you say, are there better suppliers out there? And should I be looking at the price, at the quality, at the service available from other suppliers? And particularly where you have suppliers that aren't as good at on-time delivery, that aren't trying to drive the price down for you all the time and finding ways of doing that aren't giving you a full service. You need to look at ways of managing that and seeing how can we work with the suppliers and rationalize the list. The other thing I say to you is you should be looking at ways of getting suppliers to make multiple components for you. If one is making a particular subcomponent, maybe they could make a similar part to that and do an extra add-on to add value to that component that you're currently doing in-house, and that will save you more time then in the process. It'll also, by the way, help you to reduce the number of suppliers that you have. B-class need less focus, but they also need to be managed because there's still a large amount of your supplies, but not a huge amount, but they're still significant. So you look at them and you try and maintain them and manage them as best you can. Now, we'll just give you a few examples here of looking at components and putting them into A, B, and C. If you just looked at the quantity of them, you'd see where, I'll just take it from the top here, component, and then beside that you have quantity and you have class. And below is part A, and the quantity is 500,000, and we're saying they're A in terms of volume. B, part B then is 1,000,000 units, and it's an A again. And between them, they make up 84% of the total. Part C then, that's 50,000, a lot less, and we're saying it's a C class. Part D then is 20,000, and it's also C class, and between the two of them, it amounts to about 5%. Part E is 200,000 in quantity, and we're saying it's a Part B at 11%. Now you can see all those. The top two there are the big volume movers. When you then look and take value into account and multiply that by the value of each component, this is what you get. Part A, and we look at the very top first, component, quantity, cost, and then we have value, and then the class. Part A, 500,000 at 0.1 of a dollar, $50,000. So we're saying this is class C. Part B is $1 million, $0.15, 150,000, and we're saying it's a B. So they were two A's in the original one, and they're now gone to C, and they're gone to B. Part C, 50,000, $10, $500,000, and it's an A. Part D, 20,000, $15, $300,000, and it's an A as well. And Part E, 200,000, $2, 400,000, and it's an A. Obviously, in a real situation, there'll be a lot more components, and it'll be more spread out. But it gives you an idea of looking at it with quantity only and looking at it with value. With the value, you get a clearer idea of how much money you're minding. If we looked at the original one, you'd only be putting a huge emphasis on 200,000 here, 50,000 plus $150,000, whereas really you're talking about $1.2 million here in this A class. So it's important to look at those and to build them up like that. Kanban. Use Kanban to minimize stock in production, and two-bin system, or card system. So you're using it to minimize work in progress when you use Kanban to minimize stock in production. What you're trying to do is trying to have as little stock on the factory floor as possible. Enough for, it can be an hour, it can be a half a day, it can be a day. You decide what's relevant for your business, but certainly no more than a day. There might be some very common components that are very small that you might keep a bit longer, all right. But certainly expensive components and certainly large components, no, you wouldn't. You keep those to a minimum and you work on just doing that just in time. Now, how is that managed? In Japan, they have two systems that are used widely. The first is a two-bin system where they have one bin with components in it, and they have another bin with components in it. They work from the first one and take them out, work the machines, take it out, work the machines, and so forth. When it's empty, they say, oh, that's empty. So they turn it over and put it on the far side. Pull in the new one and start working from then. What that means is that then sends a signal to someone who's in the supply area, who comes around regularly. He sees an empty bin, he knows what goes into that bin, and then he just refills it. So then again he has two bins, one he's working from, one that's there in reserve. That's a two-bin system. The same sort of system, but with cards, is a card system that you have a card on the bin. And when it reaches a certain point of emptiness, the card becomes visible, and you leave that out, it's taken and replenished then in the same sort of way. When to use? Well, particularly when you have high volumes, you use it. A steady flow, and to avoid stock shortages. So high volume speaks for itself, and a steady flow that is going through regularly. You can still manage it when this flow is not as steady, although it does take a little more planning to do that, but it's possible to do. And to avoid stock outages, you make sure there's sufficient demand in production that it's working smoothly, and that there's no surprises coming down the line. Suppliers. With suppliers, you have to look at what you want from suppliers, first of all. Can they meet your specific needs, requirements? So what we mean by that is, you will have a criteria of what's important from your point of view in having a good supplier. So what are we talking about? Having components that are right, or products that are right all the time, or almost all the time. Having products that are reasonably priced, that you can make money on them. Having products that are delivered on time when you need them. Having a system with the supplier that they can get feedback from you, and they can respond to that when there's a problem and help sort it out quickly. That's the sort of needs, requirements you would have. Have they got a quality system? Something like ISO 9000, or it may be their own system, but have they got a system that they can show that there is quality met and provable quality? That's the important thing, that it's provable. So there has to be able to see that the quality is there and it's consistent all the time. If it's not consistent all the time, or if you can't see that it's there, it may be a system. Like ISO is very good, provided it's done properly. If it's written properly, it's excellent. But sometimes it can be done too simply, or also it can be done too complex, which makes it a huge bureaucratic system for the company using it. But if it's done right, it is fantastic. The next item is, have you a service level agreement with them? Very important to look at. Service level agreement is saying what your demands are and what their demands are. And it's both of you saying, yes, we will honour these demands. It's very important to get the detail of that right, because if you don't get the detail of that right, you run into all sorts of problems. Service agreements would hold things like delivery times, quality levels that they have to achieve. The price, obviously, would be a major one. In turn, it would be that you would pay on time. So it's important they know how your system works in doing that. So working with suppliers, go and see how they operate. Walk through the factory, see how it looks, get the feel of it. Keep them informed of your plans. So if you're going to expand the business beyond what it is already, they need to know that, because they need to plan how they're going to achieve that and work towards that. So it's important to plan all of that. Build up the importance of your business with better suppliers. So focus on the better guys, build up with them, and concentrate more of the suppliers with them. Reduce the number of suppliers. So as you're building up with particular suppliers, you're maybe letting others go. And therefore, the less suppliers you have, the easier it is to manage. So it's a very important thing to have that. Have clear expectations of standards. Carry out regular audits, pay on time, and make sure they understand your system. So, have clear expectations of standards. So you know delivery standards, they're going to be in your supplier agreement. Quality standards are going to be there. And if there's a problem in quality, how it's going to be solved. Equally, make sure they understand that in order for you to pay on time, you need the invoices from them by a certain date. And they have to work with that. Work with smaller suppliers on improving them. It's very true that you should work with them, build them up, and make them better. One of the risks you run is that they may go elsewhere as well as working with you, but you have to run that risk. And if you manage them well, they won't do that. Share opportunities with suppliers. If you come across an opportunity that they may be interested in, give it to them and let them know that it's there. Finally then, supplier performance, quality, price, delivery, innovation, queries. They are all part of your supplier agreement. That is basically it. Thank you very much.